and welcome to The Bradley Show. I'm Bradley, and in today's episode I'm going to be talking a little bit about film and Disney. I've also I'm self-isolating. I've got COVID. I thought it was a bit of a cold, but apparently it isn't. So yeah, I'm in this lovely room for the next few days. Well, it's day 5 at the moment, so I've got a bit more time to go. It's the second video diary, so the idea is that I'm going to try and do regular video diaries. This one I thought I'd talk about film. So the idea behind the video diaries is that each week or each time I do them, I'm going to see how often I get a chance to do them. I'm going to try and explain a little bit about Exploding Appendix as a project, some of the other projects I'm involved in. And so today I thought I'd talk a little bit about film. And film has been kind of a big part of my work. I suppose I have made films, but I'm also really keen on writing about them. I wrote from sort of 2009 until 2015 or 14, depending how you date it exactly, for a magazine, and I helped edit a magazine called 1+1 Filmmakers Journal, and that included sort of essays about current underground independent filmmakers, but it also had essays on film. And one of the things I started to explore during that period was Disney films. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about Disney and how I started to sort of think about Disney and the way I started to think about Disney. So I suppose what started me thinking about Disney was a really interesting article I read at the time it was published in the New Left Review. I don't think that was where it was first published, but that's where I saw it, which was by Joachim Kalker, and it was called Money as We Knew It, and it was kind of a obituary in a way to money, and it was sort of exploring money as a physical object, and it was exploring that through 2 different figures. One a fictional figure, which was Scrooge McDuck, and the other was an actual figure, Leon Bloy. And Leon Bloy really hated money and didn't want anything to do with it, and absolutely delighted when wealthy, rich people died. And on the other side, Scrooge McDuck sort of leaping into pools of money, which is in the animated cartoon series, but it also sort of appears in the original comic strips and things like that. So that sort of started me thinking about Disney films, and after reading that, I started to think about that, and I ended up writing a piece on Mary Poppins. So the reason Mary Poppins interested me was because I think in Mary Poppins there's a lot about work. Because I think Disney has a real fascination with work, or at least early Disney has a real fascination with work. So, for example, if you look back to Snow White, you've got the song Whistle While You Work, which is about domestic work, but it's about work nonetheless. It's about having some sort of fun while you work, so whistling being the thing. And of course then you've got the song Hi Ho in that thing as well. So on that level, you've got this kind of fascination with work that sort of runs from Snow White right through to Mary Poppins. So Mary Poppins, in a similar vein, has the tidying up of the nursery, just a spoonful of sugar. So the idea of, just as whistling helps you get through the tidying in Snow White, just a spoonful of sugar is the kind of metaphor that's being used to talk about how to approach work within Mary Poppins. So I was kind of keen on comparing that to something like Dancer in the Dark, which is Lars von Trier's film starring Björk, where Björk plays this character who is very poor. She's a migrant living in America, and she has to work really long hours, but the way she gets through it is by imagining that she's in a musical, and so there's a kind of clatter and clang of machinery turns into the music. And I think that has a lot of parallels both to the sort of Snow White kind of thing and also the Mary Poppins thing. I suppose the other element of Mary Poppins is the chimney sweeps. So the chimney sweeps sort of leap from chimney to chimney. They're kind of considered lucky. Now that's on the one hand because good luck rubs off when they shake hands with you, but they're also lucky as lucky can be, because in some sense their life is considered lucky in this film. The reason that they're considered lucky in this film is because, unlike Mr. Banks, who's weighed down by obligation and responsibility, and discipline and rules and obsessions with discipline and rules, he's a banker. Bert, at one point, refers to him as living in a cage. And so there's this idea that actually, for all the wealth that he has, he's sort of in a cage. And this is contrasted with the chimney sweeps, who are seen as somehow free. So I don't see this as a particularly positive view. I'm quite critical of that. I think that it tends to... The idea of it's not, for example, about changing the conditions of the lives of the chimney sweeps. It's about saying the chimney sweeps are great because they've learnt how to whistle while they work. So that was kind of one of the things that really fascinated me with the whole Mary Poppins film, is the way that it's exploring not how to change the conditions of work, but rather to make it fun, make it into a game. So that was one of the things that kind of fascinated me about that film. And I suppose the other thing that drew me to it was that I was sort of interested in the rise of the Googleplex, what Chiapello and Boltanski called the new spirit of capitalism. So Chiapello and Boltanski talk about how there becomes a kind of new spirit of capitalism, and this new spirit of capitalism incorporates many elements which were traditionally seen as a critique of capitalism. So notions of authenticity, originality, uniqueness, all these kind of things that are part of the artistic critique of work start to become part of work within the framework of human resources, with the emergence of new managerial approaches. So this might be, for example, the adoption of things like flexibility. It's the demand for a sort of broader set of skills, which might actually mean some things that might dissolve the distinction between your private life and your work life. So, for example, the kind of skills you might be expected to present might be actually something more about the broader values that you might hold, the kind of authentic life you might be living outside of the workplace. And they also talk about different ways in which participation is used to, in some sense, discipline the worker. So whereas you might think breaking down hierarchies might be a good thing for the worker, in this context they look at how the disciplining of the worker can be done, or ends up being done, by other colleagues. So rather than your boss telling you off for taking sick pay, there's a sort of pressure from other colleagues not to take sick time. So these are the kind of things that they're sort of talking about. They talk a little bit about they talk about the rise of new consumerism, the ethical consumerism, consumerism that builds in sort of notions of authenticity, and other things like that. I think it goes in hand with these ideas, language of a sort of empowerment, flexibility, and other things like that. So that sort of really emerges within the 90s. So Mary Poppins is in the 60s. But in some ways, Mary Poppins could be seen as a sort of forerunner to that kind of ethic, which is the kind of more participatory idea of the workplace, the incorporation of fun and play within the workplace, and the stuff that sort of Boltanski and Chiapello talk about, which again, they're not sort of saying that this is a much more liberated model of work. It's a sort of model of work that has learned from some of the things that emerged in the 60s, actually, that has absorbed some elements of the aesthetic critique of work and uses sort of aestheticization of work in order to make it less something that you want to challenge. And in some sense, they argue that it might even be something that's more oppressive because you're enjoying, or you're more complicit within your own subjugation. So that was one of the things that I was really interested in within Mary Poppins. And that sort of drew me to start looking at Song of the South. So Song of the South is often considered kind of a racist film. I think before you can try and think of it as a racist film, I think it's worth trying to just separate why it's attempting, at least, to be an anti-racist film. I think the film is, on the one hand, an attempt to try and show that different races can live together, and they can live together in harmony. And that's pretty much what the end scene of the kind of the three kids running up the hill with Uncle Remus. So you've got a kid that's a black kid, you've got a rich white kid and a poor white kid all running together up the hill, and it sort of almost prefigures the It's a Small World After All ride, where you've got this kind of idea of sort of racial harmony. And the film seems to champion the idea that, you know, it seems to challenge the prejudice that they can't and they shouldn't hang around together. So there's the mother seems to be really upset that these people are hanging around together, and the grandmother seems to be challenging this kind of bigotry or this kind of discrimination. The problem is that the grandmother is actually the owner of a plantation. Depending on what time you place the film, she's either a slave owner or she's an ex-slave owner. So you have a kind of slave owner being the kind of moral, the sort of defender of racial equality. It's basically a film set on a plantation, and the kind of It's a Small World After All mentality of the end of the film is kind of plastered over the plantation. So rather than challenging the plantation or thinking about the structural problems of the plantation, the film imagines some kind of racial harmony within the plantation. But in some ways, this is a kind of quintessential Disney move, right? So in the same way that Mary Poppins tries to overcome the problems of work and the lives of the chimney sweeps, not by changing the nature of work, but working out how to sort of dance and sing whilst you work, or learning to have fun whilst you work. The same thing happens within Song of the South. So, you know, rather than challenging the sort of racist structure of the slave system, you would try to imagine a kind of racial harmony within the slave system or within a plantation. So that's the dilemma again with Song of the South. So there are some films that I think are a little bit more complicated. So I think in the 60s, just as the way that Mary Poppins is kind of critiquing the kind of bankers, not from a sort of we want to change the banking system. It's more like we want the bankers to learn how to have a bit of fun. So that's the general critique of bankers that it has. So similarly, that you get within sort of the Jungle Book, you've got Baloo the bear, who's sort of trying to imagine a kind of life. He's a kind of beatnik bear that's sort of trying to imagine a life outside of work. And you've got sort of the Aristocats, with cats sort of living outside of the society in a similar kind of way. And you've got sort of something like Sword in the Stone, where Merlin tries to wash the dishes using magic rather than actually working. And so the difference there is a sort of shift between starting to imagine within Disney films as something like a post-work society. How successful it achieves that, or how good it is at achieving that, you might want to think through yourself. But yeah, there's these different tensions and explorations within Disney. I mean, there's also, I suppose, Fantasia. You know, you've got Mickey Mouse and the Sorcerer's Apprentice scenes, which is less about trying to reimagine work as something that you can whistle while you work. It seems to almost look at the bad side of that. It seems to be anti that in this sense. It's like trying to get the mops to do the work for you is a terrible thing, and we need to go back to that sort of hard slog. And at least that is the fate of Mickey Mouse in that film. And sort of punished for trying to allow the mops to do the work for him. And then I suppose you get a sort of shift in sort of, especially in 90s Disney. I think that's already sort of emerging with, you know, things like The Fair Ride, you know, It's a Small World After All. There's a mood towards Disney as a model of inclusion. Now, in some ways, that isn't really about work, but you could also see that as, in some ways, reflecting something about the nature and the changes within work, especially the rise of equal opportunities policies. So, you know, Disney does try to sort of diversify in a similar kind of way in terms of the films it's making. So there is something about work going on there. I don't think it's work in the same way that Disney traditionally has been about work, or had traditionally been about work. But I think, you know, you get sort of elements of Disney trying to show that it's a much more diverse project. and a more inclusive project, and trying to imagine a kind of world where inclusion can be more expansive. So I think that's all I'm going to go into today, but I probably will have some more sessions where I talk a little bit about cinema and film and how film has been kind of important in my own thought, and share some ideas and stuff. But yes, more video diaries will be happening soon, and hopefully I'll be able to get out of this room very soon, because I'm still isolating, and I'm going to be isolating for at least another 5 days. So yes, yes, I will speak to you soon. Bye bye.
Anxiety is caught between vitrines of past and present, future amber, viewing the present ghost, the aspirations of the architects and the tenants were not